play war. He said, how'd that work? I said, well, we take the garbage can covers, we'd put them in our hands, and there'd be like a gang of us. I'm talking kids 5, 6, 7 years old. No one had guns or knives. And the game was to run up the hill against the other street as they were raining ash down upon us. And like Gladiator, bounce, bounce, bing, bing. And I said, my head would get split open 100 times in these things. I always had a knack. I don't know where the ash guys, you know what the ash is from? He said, no. I said, well, in those days, I said, they had garbage that they would burn in incinerators. And the leftover of that burn was like a volcanic ash. You know, thank God they don't do it anymore. And I said, these kids would get the ash out of the incinerator and rain it down upon us. And you'd have to fend it off. You can go home, you can get killed. So I said, many a time I'd come home with my head bleeding, with blood running down my head. I'd come home, my mother would faint before I got through the door. She was like a panic case. She'd go, oh, my God, and she'd fall on the floor basically screaming and yelling, I'm bleeding, and she's doing nothing. But I said, next door, I had an aunt who was like stoic, like Russian aunt. Nothing fazed this woman. She'd look at me with the sober face, get out the peroxide and bandage it up, and that was it. So he lit up. David did, and he says, when are you going to write that book? I was like, boom. I said, what? He said, when are you going to write that book? I said, what do you mean? He said, well, all those stories of your youth, he says, those are great stories. Well, we talked about so many different things, and it turns out that Pastor David Hall of the Big God Ministries is running a turkey drive for Thanksgiving, and he's trying to, do the right thing, and I'm going to send a little money over there. But the point is, he said, would you like to be with me on the 19th and the 20th as we give out turkeys to the poor? I says, yes. He says, no one will know anything about you. You'll just be another guy handing out turkeys. Yeah, I'm going to hand out turkeys. How do you like that? And send some money for turkeys. So he went back to when he was poor, and he said, I got to tell you, so I grew up on welfare. He said, my father left us when I was 5. He says, I'm one of 6 children. And he says, yeah, I ate the government cheese. He says with a big smile. He says, yeah, I grew up on the government cheese. And he says, I'd say to my mother, he said, Mom, if there's a God, why am I hungry? Now I said, oh, God, what a question. I said, kids are so smart. I said, they're brilliant. And he said, my mother told me never be bitter, never be angry, always have faith. Now this is the most important part of the story, is the faith that this man had. He didn't turn to bitterness. He didn't turn to anger. He didn't hate Whitey. He didn't hate America. He just did what he did, and he did it, and he did it, and he did it. And you know what? He's the richest man I've met in recent years. He is the wealthiest man I have ever met in the last 10 years. And I've met people with a lot of money. And I said, you remind me of the story that Tolstoy wrote, The Kingdom of God is Within. I said, because you do emanate the goodness. He said, well, Michael, if you don't give anything back, you're going to be empty inside. And this man lives to give, because he said in giving he gets love. Now, if this is not the epitome of what the Christian religion today is all about, I'd like to know what is. And so I guess the moral of the story is that the humanity in the other man can never be known until you have a contact with the other man. And, I remember what a particular story, before I go to the next spot, got to him. I said, let me tell you a story. My dad owned a little store, and he had started on the streets of New York with a push cart. He came from the gutter. He was an immigrant with nothing, and he never really became a wealthy man. I said, but he had a little stall inside a store, and he sold first used things, then he sold some antique things. And he always made a living. We had a house and always food on the table. And I said, well, one day, I said, it was all white people in there. I said, never did you see anyone but white people in that market. Now, remember who I'm talking to now. I'm talking to a stranger who happens to be a black man, who happens to be like, you talk about fullback football team, huge man, and we're just looking at each other and talking. So I said, it's an all-white store. In comes a black man, well-dressed. And I said, he says to my dad, how much is that? My father says, a certain amount of money. How much is that? He's pointing at different statues. All right, how much is that? How much? He says, I'll take them all. So now the man leaves, writes him a check, and my father just pulls me over and he says, I want to tell you something, Michael. He says, listen to what just happened in this store, because it's a lesson you're going to learn for the rest of your life. I said, what's that? He says, never judge a man by the color of his skin. He said, you never know who the man is, you never know what the man is, and you never know what that man's all about until you have an interaction with him. So when I told it to Pastor Hall, he says, that is a beautiful story. He says, you've got to tell that story.